Captain Sarah Chen's eyes opened to a world of impossible beauty and terrifying strangeness. The first thing she noticed was the silence. Not the empty quiet of space, but something deeper, more complete. It was as if sound itself had been filtered through crystal and emerged softer, more melodic. She tried to sit up and immediately regretted it. Pain shot through her skull like lightning and her vision blurred at the edges. The last thing she remembered was the explosion. Her ship, the UES Defiant, had been patrolling the outer rim when they encountered something that shouldn't have existed. Ships that looked grown rather than built, with surfaces that pulsed like living skin and moved through space with an organic grace that defied everything humans knew about physics. The battle had been brief and one-sided. Human weapons designed to punch through metal and ceramic armor seemed to barely scratch the alien vessels. Their return fire had been precise and devastating, disabling rather than destroying. Now Sarah understood why. She was lying on what appeared to be a bed, but it felt more like being cradled by warm, living tissue. The surface beneath her shifted slightly as she moved, adjusting to support her body in ways that felt uncomfortably intimate. Around her, walls rose in smooth curves that seemed to breathe with a subtle rhythm. Veins of soft light pulsed through the translucent material, creating patterns that hurt to look at directly. This was clearly a cell, but unlike anything in human experience. There were no bars, no obvious locks or barriers. Instead, a field of some kind shimmered in the air where a door should be, distorting the view beyond like heat waves rising from summer pavement. Through this barrier, she could see other cells arranged in a vast circular chamber, each one containing a figure she recognized with a mix of relief and dread. Lieutenant Rodriguez was unconscious in the cell across from her, his dark skin pale and his breathing shallow but steady. To her left, she could see Communications Officer Park sitting with her back against the curved wall, staring at nothing with the hollow expression of someone in deep shock. Further around the circle, other members of her crew were visible, some awake, others still unconscious from whatever had been used to subdue them. Sarah counted silently, 18 visible crew members out of the 43 who had been aboard the Defiant. The math was simple and brutal. Either the rest were dead, or they were being held somewhere else. Given what she had observed of their captors' precision during the battle, she suspected the latter. These aliens didn't seem to do anything without a purpose. As if summoned by her thoughts, movement beyond the barrier caught her attention. 3 figures approached her cell, moving with a synchronized grace that was beautiful and deeply unsettling. Sarah's first impression was of angels. If angels were made of living pearl and moved with 4 arms instead of 2. The aliens were tall, easily 7 feet in height, with elongated limbs that gave them an elegant, almost fragile appearance. Their skin seemed to shift between colors, starting as pale blue and flowing through shades of green and silver like oil on water. Most striking were their faces, which held a serene, almost religious calm that reminded Sarah uncomfortably of classical paintings of saints. Each alien had 4 arms that moved in perfect coordination with their companions. When one gestured, the others mirrored the movement exactly. When one tilted its head to examine her, the others did the same at precisely the same angle. It was like watching a single mind operating 3 bodies, and it made Sarah's skin crawl. The barrier shimmered and vanished without any visible signal or command. The 3 aliens entered her cell, their movements creating barely a whisper of sound. The one in the center, distinguished only by slightly more elaborate patterns in its shifting skin, approached the bed while the other 2 took positions on either side. Sarah forced herself to remain still as they examined her. She had been a military officer long enough to know when resistance would be futile, and when it might provide an opportunity. Right now, she needed information more than she needed to prove her defiance. The central alien extended one of its arms toward her, and Sarah saw that its fingers ended in what looked like delicate crystal formations rather than nails. These crystal tips began to glow with a soft pulsing light as they passed over her body without quite touching her skin. Some kind of scanning device, she realized. She could feel a tingling sensation wherever the light passed, as if her very atoms were being cataloged and analyzed. The scanning process continued for several minutes, the alien's expression never changing from that serene, unsettling calm. Its companions remained perfectly still, their own faces showing the same peaceful emptiness. Sarah began to wonder if they were even truly alive in any sense she would recognize, or if they were some kind of sophisticated biological machines. When the scanning was complete, The three aliens stepped back and began what could only be described as a conversation, though it bore no resemblance to human communication. They made no sounds, but their forearms moved in complex flowing patterns that seemed to convey meaning through gesture alone. The movements were hypnotic, like watching a dance performed by beings who existed in perfect harmony with each other. Sarah tried to follow the gestural conversation, looking for patterns or repeated movements that might give her clues about their intentions. What she saw instead was something that made her blood run cold. Every few moments, all three aliens would turn to look at her, their heads moving in perfect unison. During these moments, their serene expressions would flicker, showing something that looked almost like hunger. The conversation concluded with what appeared to be a decision. The central alien approached her again, but this time its crystal fingertips glowed with a different light, deeper and more intense. Sarah felt a sudden pressure in her mind, as if something was trying to push its way inside her thoughts. She instinctively resisted, and the alien's calm expression showed the first crack she had seen, a brief flash of what might have been surprise or frustration. The mental pressure increased, becoming almost painful. Sarah gritted her teeth and pushed back harder, drawing on every meditation technique and mental discipline she had learned during her years in the military. The alien's expression grew more strained, and its companions moved closer, their own crystal fingertips beginning to glow. Just as Sarah felt her mental defenses beginning to crumble under the combined assault, the pressure suddenly vanished. The three aliens stepped back, their movements for the first time showing something other than perfect coordination. They looked at each other, then at Sarah with what she could only interpret as confusion. More gestural conversation followed, this time more animated and urgent. Sarah caught repeated glances in her direction, and she began to understand that she had done something unexpected, something that had never happened to them before. The aliens reached another decision. Two of them left the cell, moving with quick, purposeful strides that suggested urgency. The third remained behind, positioning itself near the barrier and watching Sarah with an intensity that made her skin crawl. It was clear that she was no longer just a specimen to be catalogued. She had become a problem that required a different kind of attention. As the minutes passed, Sarah became aware of changes in the ship around her. The pulsing lights in the walls grew brighter and more rapid. The subtle breathing rhythm of the organic architecture became faster, more agitated. Whatever she had done by resisting their mental probe had triggered some kind of alert throughout the vessel. She looked around at her fellow crew members, still trapped in their own cells, and felt the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders. She was their captain, and somehow she had just made their situation either much better or infinitely worse. The problem was she had no idea which. The alien guard continued to watch her with unblinking eyes, and Sarah settled in to wait. Whatever came next, she would face it as she had faced everything else in her career, with determination, courage, and the absolute certainty that humanity would find a way to survive, no matter what the universe threw at them. She just hoped she lived long enough to see how. Hours had passed since the first examination, and Sarah could feel the tension building throughout the ship. The walls around her pulsed with increasing urgency, their bioluminescent veins flickering in patterns that seemed almost frantic. Her alien guard had been joined by two others, all three maintaining their unsettling vigil while engaging in constant gestural communication. Sarah had tried to rest, but sleep felt impossible under their unblinking gaze. Instead, she had spent the time observing, cataloging every detail that might prove useful later. The aliens moved with that same synchronized precision, but she had begun to notice subtle variations. The guard on the left seemed to react a fraction of a second slower than the others. The one on the right occasionally made gestures that the others didn't immediately mirror. Small things, but in a species that appeared to share consciousness, even small variations might be significant. The arrival of a new group shattered the tense quiet. 6 aliens approached her cell, moving with obvious urgency. These were different from her guards, their skin patterns more elaborate and their movements carrying an authority that was immediately apparent. The barrier dissolved before they reached it, and all 9 aliens crowded into the small space. The apparent leader, distinguished by crystalline formations that grew from its skull like a crown, approached Sarah with purpose. Its 3 companions positioned themselves around the organic bed, while the original guards moved to block any possible escape route. Not that Sarah had any illusions about her ability to fight her way past 9 7-foot-tall aliens. but she appreciated their caution. It suggested they had learned to take humans seriously. The crowned alien extended all four of its arms towards Sarah, crystal fingertips glowing with an intensity that made her squint. This wasn't going to be another gentle scan. The mental pressure that had been uncomfortable during her first examination now felt like being caught in a vice that was slowly tightening around her skull. Sarah gritted her teeth and prepared to resist again, but the alien was ready for her this time. The mental assault came from multiple directions simultaneously, probing for weaknesses in her defenses. She felt her barriers beginning to crack under the coordinated attack, and panic began to rise in her chest. In desperation, she tried a different approach. Instead of simply resisting, she pushed back, projecting her own thoughts outward with all the force she could muster. The effect was immediate and startling. The crowned alien stumbled backward, its serene expression cracking for the first time. Around the cell, the other aliens froze, their perfect synchronization disrupted. The moment of disruption was brief, but it gave Sarah the opening she needed to reinforce her mental defenses. When the aliens resumed their assault, she was ready. The battle that followed was fought entirely in the realm of thought and will, invisible to any observer but devastating to the participants. Sarah felt alien minds pressing against her consciousness, trying to map the strange pathways of human thought. In return, she caught glimpses of their collective awareness, a vast network of shared consciousness that spanned not just the ship, but potentially their entire species. It was beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. The struggle continued for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Sarah's head felt like it was being split apart, but she refused to yield. She had no idea what would happen if they successfully penetrated her mind, but she suspected it would be the end of her individual identity. The stalemate was broken not by victory or defeat, but by accident. As Sarah pushed back against a particularly vicious mental probe, one of the aliens reached out physically to steady its leader. The moment its crystalline fingertip made contact with Sarah's skin, everything changed. Pain shot through Sarah's arm as the alien's razor-sharp crystal nail sliced through her flesh, opening a gash from her wrist to her elbow. Blood welled up from the wound, bright red against her pale skin. She had expected the aliens to be satisfied with their success in finally breaking through her defenses, but instead, something impossible happened. Every alien in the cell froze. Their perfect coordination shattered completely as they stared at the blood flowing from Sarah's arm. The crowned alien, who moments before had been conducting a coordinated assault on her mind, stumbled backward with something that looked remarkably like terror in its large, dark eyes. The silence stretched for long seconds before being shattered by sounds Sarah had never heard from the aliens before. They were making noise, actual audible communication that sounded like wind chimes being played by a hurricane. The sounds were beautiful and desperate and utterly alien, but the emotion behind them was unmistakable. Fear. The crowned alien gestured frantically at the others, its forearms moving in patterns so rapid they were almost a blur. Two of the aliens immediately departed, moving with a speed that suggested genuine panic. The remaining ones pressed themselves against the far wall of the cell, as far from Sarah and her bleeding arm as they could manage while still maintaining their guard duties. Sarah looked down at her wound, confused by their reaction. It was a nasty cut, certainly, but hardly life-threatening by human standards. The blood was flowing freely but not spurting, suggesting no major arteries had been damaged. She had suffered worse injuries during training exercises and continued fighting. But the aliens were staring at her blood as if it were some kind of forbidden substance. The crowned alien had pulled out what appeared to be a scanning device, a crystalline instrument that projected complex light patterns. When it directed these patterns at Sarah's blood, the device began making sounds like a smoke alarm in distress. More aliens arrived, filling the cell to capacity. These newcomers wore different markings, more elaborate crystal formations that suggested even higher rank. They too froze when they saw Sarah's wound, their synchronized movements becoming jerky and uncoordinated. One of the newcomers approached cautiously, extending a scanning device toward the pooling blood. The moment the scanner's beam made contact with the red fluid, alarms began sounding throughout the ship. Not the subtle changes in lighting that had marked the earlier disturbance, but actual klaxons that made the walls vibrate with their intensity. The aliens were no longer just afraid. They were terrified. Sarah could see it in their movements, in the way they kept glancing at her wound and then at each other. Whatever significance her red blood held for them, it was something that challenged their fundamental understanding of reality. Sarah tried to speak, to demand answers, but her throat was dry and her voice came out as little more than a croak. The aliens didn't seem to notice. They were too busy with their urgent musical communication and their increasingly frantic scanning of her blood. Through the cell's barrier, Sarah could see that chaos was spreading throughout the ship. Aliens were moving with purpose down the corridors, their usual graceful synchronization replaced by something that looked almost like panic. Lights were flashing in patterns she had never seen before, and the organic walls themselves seemed agitated, their breathing rhythm fast and shallow. The crowned alien made a decision. It gestured sharply to its companions, who immediately began preparing what looked like medical equipment. Not the scanning devices they had been using, but actual physical instruments that gleamed with the same crystal technology as their fingernails. Sarah realized they intended to take samples of her blood for further study. The thought of these aliens having access to human genetic material filled her with dread, but she was in no position to resist. Her arm was still bleeding freely, and she was beginning to feel lightheaded from blood loss. As the aliens approached with their sampling equipment, Sarah closed her eyes and tried to prepare herself for whatever came next. She had always known that being a deep space captain carried risks, but she had never imagined anything like this. Her red blood, something so fundamental to human life that she had never given it a second thought, had somehow become the key to a mystery that terrified an entire alien civilization. The last thing she saw before losing consciousness was the crowned alien holding a vial of her blood up to the light, its expression a mixture of scientific fascination and existential dread that transcended species barriers. Whatever happened next, Sarah realized with growing certainty that her crew's fate, and possibly the fate of all humanity, now hung in the balance of what her blood represented to these impossible beings. Sarah awakened to a world transformed. The cell around her had changed dramatically while she was unconscious. The walls now pulsed with deep crimson light instead of their previous soft blue, and the very air seemed to vibrate with tension. Her arm had been bandaged with some kind of translucent material that glowed faintly, but she could still see the dark outline of her wound beneath it. The number of guards had tripled. 9 aliens now stood around her cell, but their perfect synchronization had completely broken down. Some moved in groups of 3. Others stood alone, and their gestural communication had become rapid and chaotic. For the first time since her capture, Sarah sensed genuine fear radiating from her captors. Beyond her cell, the ship buzzed with activity unlike anything she had witnessed before. Aliens moved through the corridors in streams, their usual graceful movements replaced by something that looked almost like panic. The organic walls themselves seemed agitated, their breathing rhythm irregular, and their bioluminescent patterns flickering in distress. Sarah tried to sit up and was surprised to find that her strength had returned. Whatever they had done to treat her wound had been remarkably effective. The pain was gone, replaced by a strange tingling sensation that seemed to spread from the injury site throughout her entire body. The arrival of a new group silenced even the chaotic chatter of her guards. These aliens were different from any Sarah had seen before. Where the others had been tall and elegant, these newcomers were massive, easily 8 feet in height and broader across the shoulders. Their skin didn't shift between colors but remained a deep, rich purple that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Most striking of all, they moved with absolute silence, their footsteps creating no sound whatsoever. The largest of these new arrivals wore crystal formations that covered half its skull like a crown of living gemstones. When it gestured, the other aliens throughout the chamber immediately prostrated themselves, pressing their bodies against the floor in obvious submission. Even through the barrier of her cell, Sarah could feel the weight of authority radiating from this being. The barrier dissolved at the crowned alien's approach, but unlike the previous examinations, this one entered alone. The others remained outside, maintaining a respectful distance that suggested they were in the presence of someone of enormous importance. Sarah found herself face to face with what could only be royalty among these strange beings. The alien queen, for that was clearly what she was, approached Sarah with movements that were both graceful and predatory. Her forearms moved independently now, not in the synchronized pattern Sarah had grown accustomed to. When she spoke, it was not through gestures but through a voice that seemed to come from the air itself. words forming directly in Sarah's mind without passing through her ears. The mental contact was unlike anything Sarah had experienced during the previous examinations. Instead of the brutal assault she had endured before, this felt almost gentle, like having someone carefully sorting through her memories and thoughts with infinite patience. The Queen's presence in her mind was vast and ancient, carrying the weight of centuries and knowledge that spanned galaxies. Through this connection, Sarah began to understand fragments of what was happening. The Queen was not just examining her thoughts but sharing her own, allowing Sarah glimpses into alien memories that stretched back through eons of time. She saw the rise of the alien civilization, their expansion across the stars, and their careful cataloging of countless species across the galaxy. But threaded through these memories was something else, something that filled the Queen with a terror so profound it made Sarah's blood run cold. Ancient records spoke of a species that had existed long before the current galactic civilization, beings whose very presence had shattered the natural order. They were described in terms that made no sense, creatures whose blood burned like fire and whose minds could not be touched or controlled. The Queen's mental voice carried a mixture of disbelief and growing horror. You cannot exist. Your kind was destroyed before our ancestors first looked to the stars. The Crimson Bearers were legend, myth, a cautionary tale told to children. Sarah tried to respond, to ask what the Queen meant by Crimson Bearers, but her thoughts felt sluggish and unclear in the face of the alien's vast mental presence. Instead, she found herself experiencing more of the Queen's memories, images that showed the ruins of ancient civilizations, and warnings carved in stone on dead worlds. The memories revealed that every species the aliens had encountered across their thousands of years of expansion had one thing in common. Their blood was blue, green, or purple, never red. Red blood existed only in their oldest myths, in stories about beings who had brought chaos and change wherever they went. According to these legends, the red-blooded ones didn't just resist mental control, they could turn it back on their attackers. The Queen's examination of Sarah's wound had revealed something that shook her to her core. Sarah's blood didn't just look different, it behaved differently. When exposed to their scanning technology, it had shown properties that shouldn't exist. It seemed to interact with their biotechnology in ways that suggested it wasn't entirely biological at all. Sarah felt the Queen's growing panic as more memories surfaced. Ancient texts spoke of a war that had nearly destroyed both civilizations, a conflict between the collective consciousness of the Queen's ancestors and the individual minds of the red-blooded ones. The war had ended not with victory, but with the complete disappearance of the red-blooded species, leaving behind only ruins and warnings. The Queen stepped back from Sarah, breaking the mental connection abruptly. Her forearms trembled as she stared at the bandaged wound, her expression cycling through disbelief, terror, and something that might have been awe. When she spoke again, her mental voice was barely a whisper. If you are truly what you appear to be, then everything we have built, everything we have become, is in danger. The ancient prophecies speak of your return, of the choice we would be forced to make when the Crimson Bearers walked among the stars again. Sarah tried to ask what choice the Queen meant, but before she could form the question, alarms began sounding throughout the ship with renewed intensity. The Queen's head snapped toward the ceiling, her expression shifting to one of immediate concern. Through their brief mental connection, Sarah caught fragments of the incoming communication. A fleet was approaching. Not just any fleet, but the combined armada of the alien High Command, summoned by emergency signals that had been broadcasting since Sarah's blood was first spilled. Ships were converging from across the galaxy, bringing with them the most powerful minds of the collective consciousness. The Queen turned back to Sarah, her expression now mixing fear with desperate determination. They come to destroy you, to eliminate the threat you represent before it can spread. But first they will want to understand how you survived when all your kind should have been extinct for millennia. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the ship's temperature. Through the Queen's memories, she had seen glimpses of what the alien collective was capable of when they perceived a serious threat. Entire worlds had been sterilized, their populations absorbed into the collective or simply eliminated. If they viewed humanity as a resurgence of their ancient enemy, Earth itself might be at risk. The Queen made a decision that clearly went against every instinct of her species. Instead of preparing Sarah for interrogation by the incoming fleet, She moved to the cell's control panel and began making adjustments that Sarah couldn't understand. The organic walls around them began to shift and change, growing thicker and more opaque. "I am shielding this chamber from their scans," the Queen explained, her mental voice tight with strain. "When they arrive, they will not immediately know what we have found. This will give us time to understand what your presence truly means, and perhaps to find a solution that does not end in the destruction of both our species." Sarah looked at the alien queen, this being who ruled over a civilization that spanned galaxies, and saw something she had not expected to find. Behind the fear and the ancient prejudices, there was curiosity. The queen didn't just want to destroy the threat Sarah represented. She wanted to understand it. As the sound of approaching ships grew stronger, Sarah realized that her fate, and possibly the fate of humanity itself, now rested in the hands of an alien queen who was about to defy her entire civilization for the chance to uncover a truth that had been buried for millennia. The wound on her arm throbbed with a strange warmth, as if her very blood was responding to the momentous decision that had just been made. The first ships of the alien armada arrived within hours, their massive forms blotting out the stars visible through the chamber's transparent sections. Sarah watched through the shielded walls as vessel after vessel took positions around the Queen's flagship, creating a formation that stretched beyond the horizon of space. Each ship was unique, grown rather than built, their organic curves pulsing with the same bioluminescent pattern she had grown accustomed to seeing throughout her captivity. The Queen remained in Sarah's cell, her four arms working constantly at control panels that seemed to grow from the walls themselves. The stress of maintaining the mental shields was clearly taking its toll on the alien ruler. Her opalescent skin had lost much of its color-shifting beauty, settling into a dull gray that suggested exhaustion. Despite this, she continued her work with determination that impressed Sarah. Through their ongoing mental connection, Sarah could feel the pressure building as more and more alien minds joined the collective consciousness gathering outside. The Queen's individual thoughts were being overwhelmed by the vast network of shared awareness that demanded answers about the impossible discovery aboard her ship. Sarah tried to move closer to help, though she had no idea what assistance she could possibly offer. The moment she stepped away from the center of the cell, pain shot through her bandaged arm like lightning. The Queen's head snapped toward her, concern replacing the strain in her large dark eyes. The alien Queen's mental voice carried exhaustion and growing urgency. "Your blood is reacting to their presence." The ancient texts spoke of this phenomenon, though I had believed them to be mere mythology. "The red fluid is not simply biological matter. It serves as some kind of conduit or antenna, responding to the collective consciousness of my people." Sarah looked down at her arm, noticing for the first time that the bandage was glowing more brightly than before. The warmth she had felt earlier was now almost burning, and she could see dark veins spreading from the wound site up toward her shoulder. It looked like infection, but it felt like electricity coursing through her body. The Queen approached her carefully, extending one crystalline fingertip toward the bandage. The moment it made contact, both Sarah and the alien ruler gasped simultaneously. The mental connection between them exploded into something far more intense and complex than before. Sarah found herself experiencing not just the Queen's thoughts, but fragments of the collective consciousness itself. Through this expanded awareness, Sarah began to understand the true scope of what was happening. The alien civilization wasn't just a single species or even a single world. It was a vast network of absorbed consciousness that spanned thousands of worlds and millions of beings. Every species they had encountered over their long expansion had been incorporated into this collective, their individual thoughts subsumed into the greater whole. But now, for the first time in millennia, the collective had encountered something it could not absorb. Sarah's human consciousness remained stubbornly individual, refusing to blend with the network that surrounded her. More than that, her very presence seemed to be disrupting the collective's harmony, creating ripples of discord that spread throughout the vast mental network. The Queen showed Sarah images from the ancient war, memories preserved in the deepest archives of the collective consciousness. The red-blooded species hadn't been destroyed by superior force or technology. They had been eliminated because their very existence threatened the foundation of collective society. Wherever they went, the unified consciousness of other species began to fragment, individuals breaking away from the group mind to pursue their own thoughts and desires. Sarah watched in fascination and horror as the Queen's memories revealed the truth of that ancient conflict. The war hadn't been fought with weapons or ships, but with ideas and consciousness itself. The red-blooded species had somehow been able to awaken individual awareness in beings who had never known anything but collective thought. The result had been chaos on a galactic scale, as entire civilizations tore themselves apart from within. The collective consciousness had finally achieved victory by completely isolating every member of the red-blooded species, cutting them off from all contact with other forms of life until they died alone and forgotten, or so they had believed. The discovery of Sarah and her crew suggested that somewhere, somehow, descendants of that ancient enemy had survived and flourished. The Queen's mental voice carried a mixture of awe and terror as she shared these revelations. Your people represent the greatest threat our civilization has ever faced, not because of any weapon or technology, but because of what you are. Your individual consciousness is infectious, spreading to any mind that comes into contact with it for extended periods. Sarah felt a chill as she realized the implications. If the Queen was right, then her mere presence aboard this ship was already beginning to affect the aliens around her. She thought back to the small variations she had noticed in her guards' behavior, the moments when their perfect synchronization had faltered. It hadn't been her imagination or wishful thinking. She had actually been influencing them without realizing it. The pressure from the collective consciousness outside was becoming overwhelming. Sarah could feel thousands of alien minds pressing against the Queen's mental barriers, demanding access to the discovery that threatened their very way of life. The Queen's strength was failing, and Sarah knew that when the shields fell, both of them would face interrogation that would make her previous experiences seem gentle by comparison. But something else was happening as well. The increasing intensity of the collective's attention was causing unexpected changes throughout the ship. Sarah could hear sounds from beyond her cell that suggested chaos spreading through the vessel. Alien voices raised in what could only be argument, something she had never heard from the perfectly coordinated species before. The Queen confirmed her suspicions through their mental link. The prolonged exposure to your presence is beginning to affect my crew. Some of them are experiencing individual thoughts for the first time in their lives. They are frightened and confused, but also curious. The collective consciousness is struggling to maintain control over minds that are beginning to question its authority. Sarah realized that this was both an opportunity and a catastrophe. If her presence could awaken individual consciousness in the aliens, it might be possible to find allies among them. But it also meant that her very existence was an act of war against their entire civilization. The decision was taken from them when the Queen's mental barriers finally collapsed under the sustained assault from the collective consciousness. The full weight of thousands of alien minds crashed into both Sarah and the Queen simultaneously, a psychic storm that threatened to tear their individual identities apart. Sarah felt her consciousness being pulled in 1,000 directions as the collective tried to absorb her into its vast network. But instead of submitting, she did something that surprised even herself. She pushed back with all her strength, not just defending her own mind, but actively projecting her individual awareness outward into the collective consciousness itself. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Throughout the ship and across the assembled fleet, aliens began experiencing something they had never known before: individual thought. Personal desires, private emotions that belonged to them alone rather than to the collective whole. The Queen staggered under the psychic backlash, her forearms clutching at her head as her own consciousness was caught between the collective she had always known and the individual awareness that Sarah's presence was awakening within her. When she looked at Sarah again, her eyes held something that had never existed in an alien mind before: free will. The sound of approaching footsteps in the corridor told Sarah that their time of relative safety was over. The collective consciousness was sending its most powerful agents to deal with the infection, spreading through their perfect society. But now Sarah knew that she wasn't facing this threat alone. Somewhere aboard this ship, and possibly throughout the fleet, individual alien minds were awakening for the first time in their species' history. The question was whether these newly awakened individuals would choose to help her, or whether the terror of individual thought would drive them back into the safety of the collective consciousness. Sarah's wound throbbed with increasing intensity, and she realized that her blood was somehow the key to everything that was happening. Whatever came next, there would be no going back to the way things were before. The doors to Sarah's cell burst open with violent force as 6 massive alien enforcers entered in perfect formation. These beings were different from any Sarah had encountered before, their bodies encased in what appeared to be living armor that pulsed with the same organic rhythms as the ship itself. Their presence radiated absolute authority from the collective consciousness, and their movements showed none of the confusion or hesitation that had begun affecting other aliens aboard the vessel. The lead enforcer approached Sarah without pause, its crystalline fingertips glowing with an intensity that hurt to look at directly, but as it reached toward her, something unexpected happened. The Queen, who had been struggling with her own awakening individual consciousness, suddenly stepped between them. The enforcer stopped, its head tilting in confusion. Through the fragments of mental connection still linking Sarah to the aliens, she felt the collective consciousness recoiling in shock. The Queen had never disobeyed a direct command from the collective in her thousands of years of existence. Her defiance was unprecedented and terrifying to beings who had never known individual rebellion. The Queen's mental voice, when it came, was stronger than Sarah had ever heard it. Not just her thoughts, but her own thoughts, separate from the vast network that had controlled her entire life. I will not allow you to destroy something we do not yet understand. There may be another way. The enforcer's response was immediate and brutal. Mental force slammed into the Queen's consciousness like a physical blow, trying to reassert collective control over her awakening individual mind. But the Queen had been changed by her exposure to Sarah's presence, and she fought back with newfound determination. Around the cell, chaos erupted as other aliens throughout the ship began choosing sides in a conflict that none of them had imagined possible. Some remained loyal to the collective consciousness, their minds unable to cope with the terrifying freedom of individual thought. Others embraced their awakening awareness, experiencing emotions and desires that belonged to them alone for the first time in their lives. Sarah watched in amazement as the alien civilization began to fracture along lines that had been drawn millions of years ago during the ancient war with her people's predecessors. The same choice that had torn the galaxy apart before was being offered again, and this time the outcome was far from certain. The battle for the Queen's mind became the focal point of the larger conflict. Sarah could feel the collective consciousness pouring its full power into reasserting control, while the Queen's individual awareness fought desperately to maintain its newfound independence. The psychic storm generated by their struggle spread throughout the ship and into the surrounding fleet. Sarah realized that she couldn't remain a passive observer. Her people had faced this choice before and lost. But she had learned something from the Queen's memories that the ancient red-blooded species hadn't understood. The key wasn't to force individual consciousness on others, but to offer them the choice and support them in making it. She reached out mentally, not to the collective consciousness that wanted to destroy her, but to the individual minds that were struggling to be born throughout the alien fleet. Instead of projecting her own thoughts, she offered them something far more precious: the knowledge that they were not alone in their confusion and fear. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Across thousands of ships, aliens who had never experienced personal emotions suddenly felt the warmth of connection without domination. They discovered that they could share thoughts and feelings while still maintaining their individual identity. It was everything the collective consciousness offered, but without the loss of self that had defined their existence for millennia. The enforcer attacking the Queen faltered as its own individual awareness began to stir. For the first time in its existence, it experienced doubt about its mission. The collective consciousness had told it that the red-blooded beings were a threat to be eliminated, but its own emerging thought suggested that perhaps they represented evolution rather than destruction. Sarah felt the exact moment when the balance tipped. More aliens chose individual consciousness than remained with the collective, and the vast network that had controlled their civilization for eons began to collapse under the weight of its own contradictions. But instead of the chaos and destruction that had marked the ancient war, something new began to emerge. The aliens who chose individual consciousness didn't abandon cooperation or mutual support. Instead, they began forming voluntary connections based on shared interests and genuine affection, rather than forced unity. The Queen, her battle with the collective finally won, looked at Sarah with eyes that held wonder and gratitude. Through their mental link, Sarah felt the Queen's amazement at the complexity and richness of individual thought. "I never knew," the Queen whispered in her mind. I never understood what we had lost when our ancestors chose the collective over the individual. The capacity for growth, for change, for genuine surprise at the thoughts and actions of others. The remaining enforcers, their mission now meaningless in the face of their species' transformation, lowered their weapons and stepped back. Some of them were already beginning to experience their own individual awakenings, while others retreated deeper into what remained of the collective consciousness. Sarah stood and approached the nearest wall panel, her hand hovering over the controls that would release her crew from their cells. The Queen nodded, understanding her intention without words. Together, they began the process of freeing the other humans, who had remained unconscious throughout the psychic battle that had just reshaped an entire civilization. As Sarah's crew members began to awaken, they found themselves in a world transformed. The aliens around them no longer moved with perfect synchronization, but with the beautiful chaos of individual choice. Some approached the humans with curiosity, eager to learn about the species that had sparked their awakening. Others maintained respectful distance, still processing the monumental changes in their own consciousness. Lieutenant Rodriguez was the first to fully wake, his eyes widening as he took in the scene around them. "Captain, what happened? The aliens, they're different somehow." Sarah smiled, feeling a weight lifting from her shoulders that she hadn't realized she was carrying. "They learned to choose, Rodriguez. We all learned to choose." The Queen approached them, her movements now showing the slight uncertainty that marked individual consciousness. When she spoke, it was through a translation device rather than direct mental contact, respecting their right to privacy of thought. "Your species has given mine a gift we thought we had lost forever," she said, her voice carrying harmonics that spoke of wonder and gratitude. "In return, we offer you safe passage home and the promise that this conflict between our peoples is ended. The ancient war is over, and both our species have survived to find a better way." Sarah looked around at her crew, then at the aliens who were experiencing freedom of thought for the first time in their existence. The wound on her arm had stopped glowing, the strange warmth fading as the psychic storm subsided. But she knew that the changes sparked by her blood would spread throughout the galaxy, as other aliens encountered their transformed brethren. The journey back to Earth would take months, but Sarah knew they wouldn't be traveling alone. Ships from the alien fleet would accompany them, not as conquerors or guards, but as the first ambassadors from a civilization that had chosen evolution over stagnation. As the great ships prepared for the journey home, Sarah touched the bandage on her arm one final time. Her blood had indeed been the key to everything, not because it was a weapon or a tool of destruction, but because it carried within it the most powerful force in the universe, the potential for choice. The red-blooded beings had returned to the galaxy, not as conquerors or destroyers, but as teachers of an ancient truth that had been forgotten in the rush toward collective consciousness. Every individual mind mattered. Every choice had meaning. And sometimes the greatest act of courage was simply deciding to think for yourself. The stars ahead held infinite possibilities, and for the first time in millions of years, both humans and aliens would face them with the full knowledge that, whatever came next, they would choose their destiny together, as individuals united in common purpose, rather than as minds subsumed into something larger than themselves.